Are we in it for the long haul? The conflict continues. The breakdown starts now. Good evening and welcome to The Breakdown. I'm Tara Setmayer. The Rick Wilson is still off, but he will be back on Tuesday. So don't worry, he's coming back. We'll see him Tuesday. But tonight, I also have another fantastic guest to chat with about what's happening in Ukraine. He's an international relations expert. He's the host of the very popular Deep State Radio. David Rothkopf is with me tonight to talk more about what's happening in Ukraine. He wrote a piece and said, we might be in this for the long haul. We need to be prepared for it, and has some interesting things to say about his assessment of the Biden administration's handling of it all. So stay tuned for David. But before we get to him, we got to talk a little headlines, a couple of domestic things going on besides Ukraine, which is incredibly important. But there's some things happening in the U.S. too. And I wanted to mention voter fraud. Yes, we've heard a lot about it. We've heard a lot of it coming from the Republican Party. They have been screaming about voter fraud and tampering with machines and all of these things. Well, guess what? We have found out that a Republican election official in Colorado was just charged with 10 counts related to tampering with voting equipment. Yep, Republican Tina Peters, the Mesa County clerk, she was charged with attempting to influence a public servant, criminal impersonation, conspiracy to commit criminal impersonation, identity theft, first-degree official misconduct, violation of duty, and failing to comply with the Secretary of State. What was she doing? Well, apparently she broke into secure election offices. She tried to turn off security cameras. She copied hard drives and softwares. That sounds an awful lot like voter tampering. Vote tampering. This is what the crazy Republicans and Trump and the Unleash the Kraken lady over there, Giuliani, all of them were claiming that this was somehow happening with Democrats. We have yet to see one Democratic county clerk or elections clerk or administrator be charged with anything like this, not that I'm aware of, but here we have another Republican. This is not the first time that we have had an instance of very questionable behavior concerning our votes. There was a guy in Pennsylvania who tried to vote not once but twice using his dead mother's name to vote for Donald Trump. This wasn't happening with Democrats in Pennsylvania that we're aware of. And don't forget what happened in the Villages down in Florida, where there was some shenanigans going on with voting fraud down there. So this is a perfect example of where Republicans are trying to accuse Democrats of things that they are doing in front of you. Tina Peters, another interesting tidbit about this woman. We're going to pay attention to that case and see what happens with her. She's just accused. This happened in Lauren Boebert's district. That primary was an interesting one. And obviously we can't go back and fix anything now. But no coincidence that this happens in one of the districts with one of the most batshit crazy members of Congress. And there was some shenanigans going on with this woman. 10 counts. That's not a small thing. So what else happened in the voter fraud, questionable voting behavior space? Mark Meadows. Remember him? Yes, the chief of staff, the former chief of staff and former congressman in North Carolina. Well, what did Mark Meadows do? Well, while Mark Meadows was running around the country in 2020, claiming that there was all this voter fraud, he was claiming that him and his wife, their primary residence was a 14 by 62 foot trailer in North Carolina, that was their primary residence. Really? Now, we all know that when he resigned from Congress to become the chief of staff to Trump, that he sold his house and moved his family to outside Washington and Northern Virginia. How do we know this? Because property records are public. But then in the fall of 2020, he goes ahead and he registers as this 14 by 62 foot trailer as his primary residence so he can vote in North Carolina. Does anyone actually believe that that's where he was living? I sure as hell don't. And the story that came out, I encourage folks to go back and read it in more detail. But there are people who are saying that they saw his wife there maybe once or twice. They never saw him there. Now, these are accusations that happen often. There's a lot of times when in Oppo research, one of the first things that you do is look to find out, was this person actually living in their district? And for people who have been elected for long amounts of time, a lot of times they don't go back home. They have their part. They live here outside DC or in DC because they spend most of their time in Washington. And that's usually an accusation that an opponent will use against them that they're out of touch with their district. But this right here is pretty rich, coming from Mark Meadows, who led the effort alongside Giuliani and others with all of these accusations of false accusations of voter fraud. Meanwhile, he may have engaged in voter fraud himself. And there are some election experts who are saying that this is pretty clear. Mother Jones, it was the New Yorker, by the way, who broke the story about Mark Meadows. The New Yorker's reporter, Stephen Green, reported that Stephen Green, who's a professor of political science in North Carolina, he said that it is honestly hard to see how this is not a clear violation of federal law. Yeah, you can't go and register. And the timing of all of this was curious as well, because it was only a month before the election. So we're going to keep an eye on this story too and see what happens, because Mark Meadows is in a world of hurt right now. Besides all of the stuff that happened while he was chief of staff, now let's add this to the mix. I don't think Mark Meadows is going to have a good 2022. Who else is not having a great 2022? Donald Trump. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but Trump was over the weekend. He was in New Orleans. And because there's every quarter, the RNC has these meetings, and they had a big donor event, and they didn't have it at Mar-a-Lago. They had it in New Orleans, a big fancy hotel there. And Trump went, which he very rarely leaves to go do these things unless he feels he needs to. So I guess maybe he's getting cabin fever in Mar-a-Lago, or he wants to make sure that he's still relevant. So he gets on a plane and flies to New Orleans, gave his stupid speech, gets on the plane, engine failure. They had to turn around and come back. So when I heard this story, it took a couple days for the story to come out, because obviously the world is focused on Ukraine and that and things like that. But my first question was, wait a minute, he was on a donor's plane? Because it wasn't his plane. Remember the Trump Air Force Trump, or whatever the hell they called it during the campaign? I don't know what happened to that plane, but obviously it hasn't really been used much, because when Trump was president, he flew on Air Force One. He wasn't flying on his personal plane. And so he had some donor plane. They went back to the airport, and they had to call another donor to bring in their plane so that he could fly back home to Mar-a-Lago. Okay, could be a routine maintenance failure or whatever. But guess what they did? In true Trump fashion, they tried to raise money off of this. There he is, the grifter in chief, once again, put out an official update on Trump Force One, saying that, oh, no one really knew about this, but there's a new plane that we're building, and we want you to be the first to know, and don't tell the media. Send us some money to help fund Trump Force One. Are you freaking kidding me with this guy? He's supposed to be a billionaire. He's brags about how much money he has, and he's begging people for money to help build his new plane. Come on. It has very late night televangelist vibes to me, Send us the money because we need a plane for missions work. Come on. The sad part is there's a lot of rubes out there that'll happily send it because, oh, we've got to help Trump Force One. I want to be a part of it. Get out of here. Now, my theory is, well, obviously we all know that Trump doesn't have as much money as he claims. But my theory here on this is that too many people like me were asking, well, where the hell's your plane? Why are you borrowing donor planes? So they put this out and had to think of some kind of bait and switch to make it look like there was a reason why, because there's this big plane that they're going to build. That's why we weren't on our plane. Not that he's broke and probably can't maintain it, and it's a piece of junk, his original plane. So they're not fooling anyone. They just make themselves look absurd. So that's a little tidbit on that. A little bit of good news before I bring in David Rothkopf. So Biden poll numbers are actually going up. which is a good thing. I just finished an hour and a half panel with my good friends David Gergen and Ron Brownstein talking about this and how Biden can turn it around. Well, the Ukraine crisis, unfortunately, it's a crisis, but it is giving Biden a bit of a bump coming out of the State of the Union. And he's actually over 52% with the American people on how he's prosecuting this war, how he's handling it. Is he stepping up to the plate? And over 50% of the American people think he's doing a good job on this. That's good news because I think it's really important for Biden to translate, that his leadership translate to the American people, because the poll numbers haven't been great because he's been saddled by this inflation problem and then high gas prices. So the environment has been really, really tough for him politically. So I'm glad to see there's a bit of good news on that. But I'm not the only one who thinks he's doing a good job. Let's see what our guest for tonight thinks. Let me bring him in. Tonight, we have David Rothkopf, who is no stranger to international relations and strategy. In a recent piece, like I said, in the Daily Beast, he argued that we need to be prepared for a very long war with Putin and this battle in Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's not going to be over tomorrow. And he also hosts Deep State Radio. So, David, welcome.
Nice to be here.
So talk to me about your Daily Beast piece. Why do you think that the American people need to be prepared for this to be an extended conflict?
Well, first of all, because that looks like where it's headed. You know, Russia thought they'd come in and win it in a day or two. They were wrong about that. They thought the Ukrainians would essentially fold at the first sign of pressure. They were wrong about that. They thought Europe would not unite in response and supply Ukraine. They were wrong about that. And they thought that the Biden administration would be too distracted by political division at home and be unable to play the traditional leadership role the U.S. has played. And they were wrong about that. And so what has happened now is we're over 2 weeks into this. Russia has not taken a major city. They had thought they were going to take Kyiv. They haven't done that. And they have been pushed back and sustained huge losses. You know, by sometime next week, probably, Russia will have lost more troops in Ukraine in, say, 3-4 weeks than they lost in Afghanistan in 10 years. And the Afghanistan failure was such a catastrophe that it helped to bring down the Soviet government. And so, you know, they're in a bad way. They're not going to win this quickly, but it's also unlikely that Putin's just going to give up and go home. So what happens? They destroy cities. They take a few cities, and you end up with a long, protracted insurgency. And, you know, is it possible that the Ukrainians will push them out sooner? It's possible. But I think we need to prepare for this longer eventuality, because that's really the only way that we can win. And it is likely to be the thing that is most intimidating to the Russians. And what does it mean? It means sanctions have to stay on, and that the sanctions actually have to grow stronger. It means that we have to use all the tools at our disposal. So I'm sorry, I have a barking dog in the backgroground.
Oh, don't worry. Usually Rick has 5 or 6 of them, it sounds like, in the background. So one is okay.
Well, I just have one, and he's a good watchdog, and I'm sure there's no Russians coming through the front door. But
that's right.
But in any event, we have to be able to provide financial support for the Ukrainians. We have to. I'm going to close my door here. One second.
That's okay.
Grizzly, stop it.
You know, we are a pet-friendly program, so no worries.
Well, I really apologize. He's usually much better about this sort of thing. In any event,
keeping financial pressure with the sanctions.
Well, we have to maintain financial pressure, but we also are going to have to supply Ukraine. And we're going to have to be able to up those supplies. And, you know, the U.S. Congress is about to pass $14 billion in aid for Ukraine. And that's good right now. But if this goes on for another couple months, we're going to have to be able to do that again. And the American people are now enduring higher gas prices.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to have to be able to continue to do that. Europe's going to have to maintain their will. And so if we don't plan for this, if we don't prepare for it, if we don't build the political will to do it, then Russia's going to look at this and say, sooner or later, Ukraine will crumble. And if we do it, then Russia's going to say, there's no way to achieve our goal here. We're ultimately going to lose.
Let me ask you a question about that. Well, two things. I worry about the attention span of the American people. Everyone is united now, mostly. But what happens when $5 and $6 a gallon of gas goes all the way through the summer? What happens when we're not seeing these images beamed into our living rooms, these horrific images of what's happening in Ukraine that's keeping people engaged? I can't imagine that the cable news networks are going to cover this wall to wall for months at a time. Maybe. I mean, CNN covered a missing plane, for goodness sakes, for months at a time. This is a lot more important than that. But I'm worried that the attention span of the American people may not. I think it's too short. They may say, "Yeah, okay, whatever," and then forget about the importance of why we need to be in this fight. And do you think that the Biden administration is able to explain to the American people, because I don't know if they've done a good enough job yet explaining to the American people why they need to be prepared and why we should stay fully engaged in it?
Well, first of all, I share your concern. It's one of the things I mentioned in the article. We do have a short attention span. Other things will happen. We will be distracted. And Ukraine seems very far away to a lot of people.
Right.
And so I think it's likely that the cable news networks will continue to point cameras in this direction because it's the one thing they're really quite good at. You don't get always the best analysis or, to drill down into the, minutiae of American domestic politics, but covering a war, having people there, pointing, they're good at it. They get good ratings for it. That's likely to continue. But you're right. The leaders, the president, the vice president, members of Congress, even, and I know this is kind of a difficult concept, but even patriotic Republicans are going to have to get out there and say, look, this is not a distant war. This is a war about our enemy who's trying to attack our system, who's breaking in the international laws we struggled to establish, that is inches away from violating borders we have sworn to protect. And that could plunge the world into global cataclysm at any minute. And so the message has got to be the Ukrainians are not just fighting for Ukraine, they're fighting for American democracy, European democracy, and peace. And we've got to support that.
I agree with you. And in, pre-Trump days, I think Republicans would have been out front like that. When you had leaders like John McCain and others who understood the importance of the moment and and understood the threats that something like what's happening in Ukraine posed to us as well and the global order. I don't know who those people are now in the Republican Party because they're too interested outside of maybe Mitt Romney. They've all, I think, ceded their moral authority to take that position because they supported Donald Trump through all those years. And when he and they voted to acquit him in an impeachment where he tried to extort the president of Ukraine by withholding key security money and weapons to protect them from Russia, to try to get some political dirt on Biden that was completely made up. So I don't know who those Republicans are. I would love to see someone step up and say that. But it seems to me like that's in contrast with what Donald Trump, who's still the leader of the party, is out there doing, praising Putin as a genius and savvy, and longs for and admires the authoritarianism and the brutality that dictators like Putin and Kim Jong-un represent. I don't know.
Well, it's very reasonable to wonder about that. When you were talking earlier about Trump's plane, And you
Yeah.
said he sounded like a televangelist, sort of Jim Baker saying, "Please send me your pennies. I need another jet."
Hmm.
Um, you're right, and I thought as you were saying it, this is the first, the Trump is the high televangelist of the first church of Vladimir Putin. And because, he has chosen his side on this. When you look at pictures from Ukraine today of mass graves, of mothers and their children lying dead in the street, of maternity wards destroyed and bloodied mothers giving birth on the ground outside of the church, outside of the hospital. Um, that's what Trump was calling genius.
And
Um,
savvy.
that's what he thought was savvy. And Mike Pompeo called him savvy and a statesman. And today or recently, I saw a video today. Madison Cawthorn
Hmm.
attacked Zelensky, and Representative Massey, who's an established idiot, but Representative Massey, was passing on Kremlin propaganda that the U.S. was operating bioweapons facilities in Ukraine. And so all of these people have lined up, and they have lined up in the middle of a war for a war criminal.
That's
They're
right.
lined up in the middle of a war against the United States and our allies for our enemy. And
It's extraordinary.
there's no gray area here.
That's
This
right.
is black and white. This is evil and good, and they've lined up with evil. And I think, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, and they said February 24th, 2022 marked the end of the post-Cold War era. I think that's right. I think geopolitics has changed in the world. But I also think, in a way, it marks the defining line for the Republican Party. Because either they become an anti-American, anti-democracy party of Putin and choose to own that, which would be repulsive, or somebody's going to have to step out with an alternative.
I agree with you, and I'm in the process of actually finishing a piece for NBC Think about the Republican Party's Putin problem, speaking to this very issue and how they cannot have it both ways. You can't claim that you stand for democracy. You can't wear the blue and yellow lapel pins and cheerlead the resilience of the Ukrainians fighting for their self-determination and freedoms against an autocrat, and still accept Donald Trump as the head of your party and welcome him and cheerlead him at the same time. It is a blatant contradiction, and the party needs to reckon with that contradiction if they have any hope of having any moral authority ever again on anything. Let me ask you about how you think Biden is doing in this. Enough about the Republicans. Let's talk about the president of the United States, who I think has been doing a really, really good job and not getting enough credit for it. But I was encouraged to see that some polling shows over 50% of the American people are giving him credit for it. Should be higher, but what do you think? Is he doing a good job?
Well, I think he's not just doing a good job. I think he's doing an extraordinarily good job. I think he's doing, frankly, a historically good job, and I think his entire team is doing that. But I'm gonna do that old Washington trick of ignoring a question for a second, and I'm gonna go back and say, let's talk about the other president too, because the other president began his campaign by going to the Republican National Committee, and the only thing he changed in the platform was to cut out support for Ukraine.
Yep.
The other president, while he was in office, supported the Russians. When Ukraine ships were attacked, he said, we're not going to do anything to that about the Russians. When people in his administration wanted to punish the Russians for poisoning their citizens in the UK, he tried to block it and then tried to fire those people. During his administration, obviously, he was impeached for trying to keep military aid from Ukraine. And his Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, has said that it was his understanding that Trump's plan was to pull out of NATO if he were reelected.
That's right.
So, the prior president was on the other side. But here is this president with more foreign policy experience than any president in American history, and a team that has been together for a long time. And they've had quite a good record getting America back into the international community, getting out of the longest war, and so forth. But in this case, the record has been exceptional, better than in these other cases. They've taken a complicated alliance with 30 different countries in it and helped bring it back together. They've led within that alliance, not with bullying or unilateralism, but by listening and by being a good ally. They've mobilized action from within that alliance that 3 weeks ago, if I'd been talking to you, we would say, are they going to stop Nord Stream 2? No. Are we going to sanction oil and gas? No. Are we going to shut down SWIFT? No. Are we going to get 141 countries in the United Nations to vote against Russia on this thing? No. This has gone so well for the US that there are now intelligence reports, according to our own CIA director, that the Chinese are going, we may have gotten too close to the Russians. They've totally misplayed this thing. Tony Blinken, you've seen him in a dozen countries in the past 5 days, talking to world leaders. He has their respect. The diplomacy that's going on in state or with Treasury Department maintaining the sanctions, or with the military putting together a massive airlift, or the coordination that's going on within the NSC, or today's performance by the vice president in Poland. Not, vice presidents sort of would go to the funerals of dead world leaders. Mike Pence, I don't even know if he has a passport, and right. And Dick Cheney didn't cover himself with glory as a vice president. But Kamala Harris has been doing tough issue after tough issue, whether it's the southern border or going to the Indo-Pac region or cleaning up after we had a kerfuffle with the French on AUKUS or going to the Munich Security Conference. And today she was on the front line here in Poland, providing support and being seen as a peer by another world leader. So we've got a great team out there. And so far, not only are they doing it all right, but there's actually bipartisan support for this $14 billion for Ukraine.
Right.
There's actually, as you say, he's gotten the biggest bump of his political career as president in the past 2 weeks, not just on Ukraine, as your poll talked about it, but in terms of some general polls, he's gone up 7 or 8 points.
Yeah, since the State of the Union, which I thought he did an excellent job. I thought he overperformed on that. And again, I think he surprised me with how many bipartisan applause lines they had. It was a very smart and that was smart and savvy way to get Republicans in so that Biden could still show the American people, see, I can bring people together. And it seemed to work. How long that lasts remains to be seen, as you know. But let me, I actually wanted to show something to you before we go. The Lincoln Project decided that it was important for people to understand the point that you just made about what an extraordinary job Biden is actually doing as president of the United States in comparison to what we had before. But to remind folks that we really need to stand with the president at a time like this. The ad is called Red Phone. Just take a look.
The 3 a.m. phone call when America and the world face the darkest challenges and the greatest danger. Every president faces that call. Only a few rise to the moment. President Biden answered the call, leading America and the world in defense of freedom. Joe Biden, America's president.
I have to say, you can't go wrong when you have the voiceover by Peter Coyote.
He's a friend of the Lincoln Project. You've heard the voice
every
before.
time as soon as it began, I was like, oh, it's that is sort of the voice of authority, and
yes,
but it's not hyperbole. I'm a Democrat. I was in the Clinton administration, but I also worked for Henry Kissinger. I've been on both sides of this thing. I've written a number of books on how foreign policy works. In my books on the NSC, the heroes, the people who make it work the best are often Republicans. Brent Scowcroft was the best national security advisor we have. George H.W. Bush did a really good job. Richard Nixon, for all of his flaws, 50 years ago, sought to balance China against Russia in a way that we really ought to be paying attention to now.
That's
I
right.
got to tell you, in my lifetime, this is the best team. And with this crisis, it's the best team doing the best job in a time of crisis that I've ever seen. Now, it's early days.
Sure.
Mistakes can be made. But we're lucky because this is not, pickup sticks. This is the most evil man in the world with 6,500 nuclear warheads.
That's right.
Deciding to lay waste to the largest country in Europe with 45 million people. And this could instantaneously turn into a global conflagration. And you look at Joe Biden and you look at all the things that he's done, but I'll focus in on one thing that has happened that also deserves credit. 2 or 3 times, Vladimir Putin has said, you're pushing me too hard. If you push any harder, we're going to end up with the worst consequences, sort of rattling his nuclear saber.
Rattling, yeah.
And you know what Joe Biden did? One of the hardest things in the world for a leader to do. Nothing.
That's
he didn't rise to the bait. He stayed cool. He displayed resolve. He did not get played. He did not get played by Vladimir Putin. And every person on the planet, every American, wherever you are, whatever party you're in, you got to be thankful for that.
Listen, I think the American people need to constantly be reminded of what would it have looked like if Donald Trump was president right now. That is certainly not how he would be handling it. He would be on the absolute wrong side. And I just don't, I hope that, and with ads like our I call it the 3 a.m. ad, but it's called Red Phone because of the original ad from the 80s in Mondale, and then Hillary Clinton modernized it with the 3 a.m. Ad against Obama. But anyway, things like that I think are really, really important. And I encourage folks, if you guys liked that ad, it's all on all of our social, please share it with people who you think need to hear it. Because there are people out here who don't think that Joe Biden is up to the task, or that somehow, he's not meeting the moment. And that's just absolutely not the case. And I'm glad that David, with all of your years of experience, all the way back to Kissinger, which I did not know, words of high praise from you, seeing all of those different administrations and how they've handled conflict. As we close, what happens when this is all over, David? What does this look like? Because we see a humanitarian crisis unfolding, unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes in Europe. And what does this look like? How do we rebuild? Are we going to have a Marshall Plan or what?
It's hard to say, but I think there are a few things. One, it looks worse for Vladimir Putin than he is now. He is weaker. Russia is weaker. Its economy is weaker.
Right.
They will never again be able to be treated as equals on the world stage until Putin is gone. And so I think they're damaged by this thing. Clearly, Ukraine is devastated. We can't bring the lives back. It's going to cost probably hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine. We're going to try to demand Russia do it. They won't. We're going to end up having to do it. Will Ukraine end up in the EU? Possibly, probably. Will it end up in NATO? Who knows? Will NATO be bigger? Will Finland and Sweden be in NATO? Yeah. Will NATO be more resolved? Yeah. Will there be more NATO strength farther forward because we don't trust the Russians and we see them as a threat? Yes. Has China changed its calculus on Taiwan? I bet they have.
I think so too. I was worried about that because obviously China hanging out over there has been eyeing Taiwan as a nuisance and, wants to take them back for quite some time. And I was concerned. I just came off a panel with David Gergen and Ron Brownstein, and we were talking about the role of China in all of this. And David, of course, made the point, he worked for Nixon, about that. The whole point of Nixon and Kissinger and everyone trying to normalize relations with China back then was to get them away from Russia at the time.
Right.
And we've seen Russia and China now kind of come back together and form a bit of an alliance. That's a little concerning. But I think China is, like you said, they have a lot to think about. It's not that simple.
Well, I think, it's not that simple, because I also think there's some people who want us to get into a Cold War with China right now.
Mm-hmm.
And while there's plenty to worry about China, that's precisely the wrong thing to do right now.
Right now.
The wrong thing to do is to drive them into the arms of the Russians. We ought to find areas to cooperate where we can cooperate. We ought to find areas to compete where we've got to compete, and where we've got to stand up to them, we got to do that. And the language I just used came from a speech by Tony Blinken on March 6th of last year. So I know that's the administration's plan. And again, it's a question of being measured and using experience. And fortunately, that's the kind of leadership we have right now.
Is there any scenario, last question, where Putin survives this?
Sure. I mean, he's the richest man in the world, and he's very powerful in his own country, and he has 6,500 nuclear weapons. And the people around him know that if there were a new leader, they would end up in jail. Or, I did a podcast last night with the former president of Estonia, and he said that if Putin were overthrown, those people would end up hanging from lampposts around the Kremlin Square like Christmas decorations. So, there are a lot of reasons why they'll probably want to keep in power. But, Putin's not young. And, he thought he was going to be in office for another 12 years. And he's not. It's just not going to happen, because Russia can't get back at the head table of world nations with Vladimir Putin, a war criminal.
That's right.
At its helm.
Does the ICC prosecute him?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it does. And I think Vladimir...
He remains, but as a pariah in the world.
Yeah, I don't think he ever leaves Russia again. Yeah. I just don't think he's ever going to be able to do that.
Well, strap in, and because this is not going to be resolved tomorrow, as David Rothkopf said in his Daily Beast piece. I encourage everyone to go check that out, that we're in this for the long haul. And we need to have resolve as well, because it's worth it. Democracy is literally, we talk about it all the time. We say democracy is on the ballot. Well, now we see democracy, what it looks like to fight for it in another country. And, it's important we back them. David Rothkopf, thank you so much. Be sure to check out Deep State Radio, and we'll have you back.
Well, I'd love to come back. I'm not going to bring Grizzly back. I apologize.
That's okay.
I apologize for my dog, but you were very patient, and I'm grateful.
Don't apologize. My cat usually has a tail, or we see cat butt at some point during the show. So no worries at all. We welcome our four-legged friends. They're part of the Lincoln Project experience. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks a lot.
And as you just saw, at Tiki Cat, Tara's Tiki Cat, if you guys want to follow Tiki, he's around here tonight. He behaved himself, so it was David's dog that was the nuisance during the show. But you can always follow Tiki on Instagram. I listen to you guys. You wanted to know more about him, so follow him at Tara's Tiki Cat. I see that we have a comment here. I'm 18, from Michael Johnson. I'm 18 and I want to be a world leader and be president of the United States one day. I want to create an economy that works for all, not just for the upper and middle class. I will work with countries like China and Russia and be tough on them when they show acts of aggression and interfere with our elections. I will create programs to help the poor and the homeless, create a fair and structure education system, work with the CDC when it comes to outbreaks. Work with healthcare workers when, I don't know where the rest of it is, but Michael, I think that, how you get all of that, the devil's in the details, but good for you for having big dreams and ambitions. We want to encourage folks to get out there and serve, because we need people who have a heart to serve in order to make our democracy work well. So good for you. Work out those policy papers, Michael. Start running for a smaller office first, though. Don't just start out and run for president. Oh my goodness, that's right. Optimism is a force multiplier. Who said that? General Colin Powell. On that note, I think that's a great way to end the show tonight, and also to continue to show our support and pray for the people of Ukraine and salute them for their resolve. We stand with you. All right, folks. Rick Wilson, he'll be back on Tuesday. Everybody have a great weekend.